Welcome to a special crossover edition of Acid Horizon. Today's episode comes from LEPHT, my other project where I curate conversations at the intersection of philosophy, politics, psyche, and imagination. If you're into what we do here on Acid Horizon, you'll probably want to check out LEPHT. Supporters there get early access to all releases, plus inside access to other projects. Right now, I'm developing a new project called Vintagia, a system for intuitive movement and creative thought rooted in psychogeography and divinatory practice. This project will actually culminate in an artist residency in State College, Pennsylvania later this year, something that our supporters can take part in. So, if any of that resonates with you, hit the subscribe link and come join us at LEPHT. Now, in today's episode, we turn to François Laruelle's Vision in One and the concept of unlearned knowing, a mysticism without transcendence, without doctrine, and without mirrors. Joining me is returning guest, translator, and theorist Jeremy R. Smith as we ask, what does it mean to think mysticism from the ground of radical immanence? This is LEPHT, and I am your host, Sarepti, aka Craig, of the Acid Horizon podcast. Today's episode begins with a provocation. What if one of the most compelling theories of mysticism in our time comes not from a theologian, but from a philosopher, and one who hails from the tradition of French communism? In Vision in One, or Unlearned Knowing, François Laruelle offers a radically subversive rethinking of mysticism, one that abandons transcendence, escapes dialectics, and turns away from the grand architectures of metaphysical thought. In its place, we find unlearned knowing, a form of knowledge that is foreclosed to relation, stripped of conceptual content, and lived immanently, without reflection or representation. And to help us explore this idea, we are joined by none other than Jeremy R. Smith, who completed his PhD at the Center for the Study of Theory and Criticism at Western University. He's a translator of Anne-Françoise Schmid and François Laruelle, including Laruelle's Theory of Strangers, Science of People, Democracy, and Non-Psychoanalysis, forthcoming with Edinburgh University Press. Together, we'll examine how Laruelle's mysticism breaks with the Neoplatonic tradition, challenges the Gnostic thirst for the ineffable, and calls instead for a mysticism of the real, immanent, impoverished, and resistant to both theology and theory. What does it mean to know without knowing? To see without vision? To live as a subject without mirrors? And what are the risks and powers of a mysticism that cannot be taught, shared, or even spoken? Jeremy, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me, Craig. It's a pleasure to be back. Well, to be on LEPHT for the first time.
That's right. Yeah, I said welcome back.
Well, it's a once each time kind of thing. We're coming back again and again and again.
Right. Before I say, how have you been? Why don't you just reintroduce yourself to the LEPHT audience? Because I think the topic that we're approaching today, Laruelle, for many reasons, I think deserves a slow burn kind of introduction, especially given the tradition that he's coming out of, the problematic that he's putting forward, and the sort of ruins in the world of Western philosophy that he himself is trying to navigate around. Tell us about you. You've spent years translating Laruelle and engaging with his work on non-philosophy. What initially drew you to his project? And how does Laruelle's approach differ not only from classical philosophy, but from the post-structuralist thinkers that he might be grouped with, like Derrida, Deleuze, or Foucault?
That's a great starting point for us. To begin with, I guess what we could do is overview like a definition of what non-philosophy is. A lot of what we do in the past podcasts that we've had has been a matter of like delineating where non-philosophy is, what it is, how does it work, who does it, and what does it do for, everyday people or the practical side of elements of its work. So I've defined positively, in a positive manner, that non-philosophy is the use of philosophy for people, humans, for human practices that are irreducible to existing philosophical overdeterminations. So one way of thinking about that is, what are we to do with philosophy outside of its traditions, outside of its deconstructions, outside of its commentaries, outside of its repetitions? And how do we implement it for one's needs or desires or political programs, what have you? But a lot of us probably listening and reading non-philosophy in general are thinking, what, how is this different? So part of what comes down to introducing non-philosophy is to understand that what Laruelle is interested in is to introduce a democratic practice that is truly allowing for people to determine their lives in a way that could be to utilize philosophy as a material. And this is to say that it's a unilateral and not a dialectical relationship. So in a way, it is distinct from, let's say, the Marxist tradition, wherein, let's say, for example, there is the kind of dialectical relationship between thought and being, and also in the more generally the classical tradition, ever since entities, the equation of being and thought as the same. But it also allows for us to think about the ways in which we notice philosophy structuring our everyday lives. So much so that we have a whole book that we kind of discussed a little bit in our first discussion with Acid Horizon called A Biography of Ordinary Man. And in that kind of work, Laruelle introduces a lot of invariants that say, hey, we don't have man. We have man as a general kind of unitary concept that's always paired with a universal, be it history, power, sexuality, the text. And those kinds of universals mediate or determine that essence of the ordinary human being. For Laruelle, it's not that these universals are impossible to determine the human being or whatever. It's actually that the human being is this infinitely iterable, effable statement found in all of these philosophical statements. But how do we make it so that philosophy is actually in use for man rather than man or the human being in use for philosophy? And this, in a way, institutes a lot of the resounding adages and statements that Laruelle would iterate on throughout this work and as well as other writings, that it is not philosophy that, it is not man that is made for philosophy. It is philosophy that is made for man. That non-philosophy is the introduction of democracy into thought. That the real or man or people are the foreclosed to thought, or that they determine thought in the last instance alone. So we've kind of hit on some of the factors of what makes Laruelle unique in this way, partially because one of the ways in which we could differentiate, for example, Deleuze and Laruelle, is to see that there is a sort of machinic undertone of like desiring machines, for example, and how much of that is plugged in to the very thing that it is imminently leading to its decline or downfall or overturning. But for Laruelle, it's not about like leading to something's downfall or being plugged in. It's actually to be plugged out and to remain plugged out in a way that prevents being inserted into that very circuit. And it's not necessarily through this kind of like, let's say, ascetic ideal in a way to like be separated entirely from the whole world through an operation of separation. It's that really in that essence without essence, as he would say, or using Eckhart's terms, like we're going to be talking about the ground without ground or grounding, that man in his intimacy, in his real without reality, in his solitude, is precisely separated without a transcendent operation of separation. And in a way, how are we able to formulate theorems that could reflect this axiomatic framework? And what Laruelle does is inventive by creating what he calls a materiel formalism. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth in time, but materiel and not material. And I think this is if we were taking it into a translated account, it's in relationship to Max Scheler on the non-formal. So technically speaking, it's materiel or non-formal formalism. But I'm jumping ahead way too quick here, but I think in general, we're trying to think about how to envision or how to practice philosophy without oneself being a philosopher, or how does one have a mystical experience without being a scholar or a doctor or a theologian in a way. How does one access that mystical experience as being without religion?
Yeah, I appreciate this topic. In fact, I'll say right off the bat, if you're getting into Laruelle, I don't know if this is the best text based on what I've read so far. However, this has been my favorite text. And not just in terms of the content. The concepts that he puts forward to defend this future mysticism requires so much reiteration of his method that I think you get a very strong sense for what he's up to in this essay. So maybe in that sense, it might be a nice starting spot. But just to go back to the beginning of the conversation, one of Laruelle's primary concerns is putting the power of philosophy back into the hands of the people. That said, this podcast in particular, in its conjunction with Acid Horizon, has ventured the task of seeing to what extent, if at all, something like a radical mysticism for the left is even possible. And this, I think, could become a sort of pillar amongst the many essays that we read here, because I think Laruelle, whether he's successful or not, is quite rigorous in presenting us with a case for a way of rethinking mysticism in the wake of the 20th century and even some of 21st century philosophy. And just to put everything right back on the ground, I think what's always important to do especially for people like us who've been to grad school, is put this into the frame of, what are the stakes here philosophically? What is the intuition that would drive someone to philosophy to begin with, maybe not knowing anything about it, and then getting absolutely in the soup like we did and spending, decades doing this sort of thing, only to leave ourselves ask whether or not it was really worth it for ourselves in the end. But at the same time, asking whether or not the questions, the problems, the frameworks have nourished, in some sense, something like what the ancient Greeks would call psyche or soul. Like if it really has cultivated in us a kind of excellence of the soul, for example. So let me take you back to a time when somebody like myself might have been 13, 14, 15 years old, or anybody who's just getting into philosophy or mysticism or something like that for the first time. I would say that for myself, there was an inchoate sense that no matter what could be known, there was something like a secret, or there was something like a portion of myself that was either reserved or cordoned off from the rest of the world. Something sacred, we might say, which the enterprise of philosophy seemed like it might be able to nourish insight into what that was. And that's one of the reasons that I got into philosophy. And I would say that once I applied myself to being a student of philosophy and making a very modest attempt at being a philosopher myself, often we're taken off that path. And suddenly now we're in the realm of politics, for example, or talking about, dialectics or bodies without organs, or the ways in which we become reinscribed into the social, and we become sort of re-educated by the whole history of concepts that remains out there. But for me, there is always this sort of lingering question of what is this kind of secret space? What is this inchoate knowing that seems in some sense, completely opaque to all of that? And one of the first concepts that we get in Laruelle here is this concept of unlearned knowing. And even just the way that he labels that concept creates an immediate resonance with that impulse that I'm talking about. Maybe we could start there. Maybe this is a chance for a little bit of personal disclosure. I mean, is Laruelle's essay here as a facet of his project brushing up against any sort of impulse that led you to philosophy? Is there something that you see here that has that intriguing power that might bring somebody into the philosophical fold?
So I think, I mean, this is a great segue into, I guess, a little bit more of myself, but also just kind of like balancing the interest of the actual project that I'm looking to kind of bridge into here today. So one of the things is I was not a good philosophy student in like undergrad, but I think when I had my programs in my master's and my doctorate, I was much more inclined to be reading continental philosophy literature and writings and any sort of interpretations that we were dealing with. Deleuze, Derrida, and Badiou even were becoming more or less household names, or like anything that we were being familiar with. But Laruelle gauged my interest very early on when I was a student of Mackenzie Wark, and then later on with Alexander Galloway, who was on Acid Horizon, I believe. And both of them, along with Eugene Thacker, and I believe Simon Critchley, had this talk actually where they were, and Nicola Maciandora, they were all in Brooklyn during this event that I believe is called Dark Nights of the Universe or something along those lines. And it was a collection of, it ended up being a collection of writings that each of them contributed to that reflected specifically on Laruelle's poem, which is called On the Black Universe, or the Black Universe, the Human Foundations of Color, or something along those lines. And a lot of people, including myself, like very early on, tend to go to this poem and just see like, oh, this is the example of what Laruelle is all about. This is very interesting. It's very interested in like the darkness, the opaque, the unreflected, this aspect of intimacy of humanity with the universe. And it's just, it's a ripoff of a Heidegger poem that you probably would read in like poetry language thought, but it's a very fantastic reflection on that one quote from Hegel in this one piece. And to deal with like the fact that man is this not necessarily unrepresentable entity. And that's what he would argue is the unrepresentable, the real itself as an undivided instance. But it's in this poem that I think a lot of the people that read this, they say, okay, now I can read Laruelle or like be interested in his work. I think at a time I looked at that poem, I was at these lectures and I was thinking, oh, this is interesting. Then I picked up philosophy and non-philosophy, and I was like, this is translated by Taylor Atkins from Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour. And like, I love this book. I hated it. I wanted to love it at first, but I was very confused by it. But part of what was of interest to me in this is, I guess, a way of knowing oneself. Know thyself, as the Greek dictum goes, but in a way that like was using philosophy not to like penetrate into my soul, but to like be able to experience myself in a way that was looking at my true self in a way, I guess. I think in part, like what drew me to Laruelle was a lot of these reflections by secondary scholars and trying to see how how to do non-philosophy or what to kind of construct from it in a political or religious or even ethical manner. So, like I mentioned, Alexander Galloway was a big influence on that part in the very beginning. Katerina Kolozova, John Malarka were all very much in that kind of front. But the people that I find to be very impactful on this kind of religious and mystical approach has been in the Anglophone world, Anthony Paul Smith, who is a fellow translator. I have no relationship to him, even though we're both Smiths. Both of us are generic Smiths, as it were, who's translated a number of works. And I can't thank him enough for kind of introducing me to his work, Laruelle's work, and many others because of the work he's done. And Alex Dubélé, who also has translated with Jesse Hawk, A Biography of Ordinary Men and General Theory of Victims. And Alex Dubélé actually has written extensively on this kind of content with mysticism and theology in Laruelle's work. And most of this has been very eye-opening in terms of like understanding what Laruelle does with these kinds of traditions, not just for mysticism itself, but also gnosis, Gnosticism, and specifically Christology. So, for example, this book, which we'll talk about, I guess, in a little bit, is part of a series of books that was inaugurated with Future Christ, A Lesson in Heresy. And on top of that, there's also Laruelle's kind of like peers or students that have instigated further nuances in this front. So, for example, Gilles Grelet, who kind of has a very interesting framework of proletarian gnosis and kind of like a Maoist approach to non-religious gnosis and what he calls theorism, but it's like terrorism. Terrorism is what it's called. It's like terrorism, but it's theoretical terrorism. So he has a movement called that. He has a book called Declaring Gnosis, and is quite informative as part of this kind of experience with mystical thought in Laruelle, who's the subject of critique in Laruelle's work in The Struggle in Utopia at the End Times of Philosophy. But also there's another figure by the name of Patrice Guillemot, who I've kind of translated as well. He's written extensively on what he calls ousiology. So, and this is kind of like taking on elements of Trinitarian ontologies, and it's interesting stuff, but it's far too much for me to kind of go through because a lot of what he does is look into ousiology and politics, ousiology and aesthetics, ousiology and etc. It's a lot of things that I have to kind of go through as a scholar. But yeah, like Laruelle is kind of an interesting figure in this respect because it kind of allows for me to think about the intimacy of humanity, the intimacy of humanity in a way that like that is in solitude, in a way that is like completely separated from the kind of universals that dictate our lives as such. So how do we transform history without transforming ourselves? How do we change the world without changing ourselves in a way, right? So this is some things that I'm very interested in with regards to Laruelle's kind of perspective on mysticism as well. I can admit here that like I cannot say based off of my own knowledge here that I'm an expert at all in this respect. I'm not a quote authority on Laruelle in this territory, but this portion of Unlearned Knowing is of interest to me because it's like it's related to some of the factors of the writings on pedagogy that he's extensively written on, such as like on the introduction to the unteachable, and also more or less this critique of pedagogical reason that he's instituted in various writings. And one of the things that he tries to say is that one does not need to be able to mediate with knowledge to have access to knowledge. One does not have to go through education to have access to these kinds of things. Or more or less, how is it that we are ourselves, for example, a knowledge, and how that itself is related to, let's say, a science of the world, a science of hell, in a way, is what he says. Like, he makes the equation of world equals hell in this book, and how itself, like, our own experiences are truly a science, not in a positivistic sense, but in a way of a rigorous experience or experiment with the world around us, so much so that it's like we do not get determined by them or by this world. We may be, to use the adage, we may be in the world, but we're not of it, in a way. Like, what is that? John 3:16.
One of the profound things about this particular text is its attack on Gnosticism and Neoplatonism, insofar as it instigates the kind of dialectical thinking that we ordinarily associate with those traditions. But ironically, for Laruelle, there is resonance with some of the thinkers in the Neoplatonic tradition, as far as I know them. There's one who comes to mind, Proclus, for example. The distinction that's made between vision of God and vision in God seems to map onto a distinction that we get in Proclus with respect to psyche and psychology, that there's a knowing of things, of the world, and then there's a knowing in things, a kind of inward knowing. And this is something that James Hillman picks up to describe and vindicate the tradition of psychology as he sees it. And anybody who's been listening to this podcast and is making connections along the way, one of the areas of overlap between Laruelle and Hillman, I would say, is that they pick up this distinction between knowing of and knowing in, and it becomes a very important part of their project. However, the one thing that Hillman, as a psychologist, observes as a risk is metaphysics. That metaphysics is always chasing behind this knowing in, the kind of inward knowing, and in some cases would even preempt the possibility of a kind of knowing in the soul. Whereas Laruelle, he's pointing out something very similar, but in order to do it, he's not giving up philosophy. And I would say there is a metaphysics here. It's out there, and we're forced to contend with it. But I think he acknowledges perhaps the limitations, or at least he's trying to construct the metaphysics in a way that remains perforated to that aspect of our soul, of humanhood, as he says, of ourselves as a subject, that continues to honor that original philosophical impulse to understand oneself as a subject, but not one as defined by worldly knowledge. And so I was hoping that we could kind of circle back to this concept of unlearned knowing. And how does he develop his argument from this concept of unlearned knowing, given that it's part of the title of this essay?
Yeah, for sure. I think this is actually a very good distinction, knowing of the world and knowing in the world. Knowing of the world and knowing in the one, for example. And I think this is the hard thing about translating, is that we tend to lose the very nuances of certain things with regards to the on. So the in the vision in one is actually en, on. It's different from dans, which means within or inside or into. So when we have that on, it's kind of like a causal way of thinking. It ensues from that way of knowing, rather than it goes and ascends or descends into, right? So it's not a self-interior. It's not this inside that we need to penetrate or get into. We are in the one. It's not alongside us. We are in the one. We are of the one, and we are the one. We are the one, is what he would say. He does say, actually. He does say in non-philosophy and philosophy and non-philosophy. So the in in this respect is not some inner world or interior or anything of the sort. It's actually, let's say, like an analogy, is a kind of like force field. It's a way of like thinking about a force field that is, or like the stone of the soul, the stone soul, in a way that like we are preventing any sort of penetration from the outside world. And this unlearned knowing is more or less similar to, let's say, the abditem mentis, the hidden a priori that of all this kind of knowing that is like in the soul, that is irreducible, but it also sets up that kind of union of God and man in a way that like represents the kind of like the fact that humans are divine, or kind of access or have a part of the divine. Rather, it's not in that way. It's more or less, or rather, it is in connection to how the soul is a part of the human, or humanhood, as opposed to the Godhead or deity. So he contrasts humanity, as it's commonly translated, humanity, with the deity. I went in this text with humanhood because Godhead is one way of translating godhood, or it's like the old Germanic word of deity or godliness in a way. So humanhood is like meant to be the distinction between that kind of unity of all humans in the world, and actually the part of which all humans participate of, in a way. We all participate of this intimate union of man. And this is where the man in man, or human in human, and also the one in one kind of framework is instituted. And unlearned knowing is precisely this non-relation. It's this way in which we know and access this part of humanity without having to exit from outside of itself to know the world around it. At the same time, he does use these words and ways of formulating, for example, given without givenness, or received without reception, or given received without givenness. This idea that we are granted things of the world in the one, not because they are gifted to us, or like wrapped in a nice bow and it's like, here you go, but rather it's because if we think about this closed castle of the soul, the strong castle of the soul, it is given without givenness, in the sense that like this access is already immediately granted to me without having to be mediated through the school or through the monastery or through some sort of experience with God. My experience with humanity is very much so ingrained in my own experience. It's lived. So he differentiates between unlearned knowing and learned ignorance. So we philosophers, this is a critique of Hegel, like he's making a question about that. No, it's we, the ones without philosophy, unlearned humans, we, the untaught students, for whom philosophy is a symptom. The sufficiency and heroism of thought, whether it is announced as weak or strong, is what we no longer want in philosophy, especially the free vacuity of thought as a cause for unteaching, the real transcendental indifference for any particular, partial, and vindictive doctrine. This is to strip the in man of the sufficiency of philosophical and theological science by stripping man who is in man, right? So we no longer trust doctrines and systems, but another type of knowing as radically universal. So rooted in this radical aspect of humanity, as it is radically insufficient. This is unlearned knowing, which probably belongs to gnosis, and in a way that like is related to historical and traditional aspects of gnosis.
By the way, I love the use of the word probably there.
Yeah, probably belonging to gnosis. This is what he says. Man is an untaught knowing. The materiel like we were talking about this before, materiel a priori, for any spiritual type of knowing more elevated than taught religious knowing. If the mystics and Platonists reclaim a hyper wisdom grounded on one ignorance, we report our knowledge full of ignorance, an unteachable lived experience, but all the more capable of being occasionally taught from our relations with God and hell. So this is where the difference lies. Our conditions of knowing are not determined through education, through teaching, through any sort of mediated pedagogical relationship, but these are treated as occasions for our knowing. So there's an occasionalism that's presented in this work, very much like impacted by Malebranche, and who else does this occasionalist thinking? But let's just say Malebranche. Let's just cut it there. But like learned ignorance, he continues, testifies to the false modesty of philosophy and its taste for a founding nothingness. It grounds a derived knowledge full of teaching upon the absence of any real or immanent knowing.
Can I stop you there for one moment?
Yeah.
Let's unpack that a little bit, because there's quite a bit there. But let's put this to a test. So what we're saying is there's a form of knowing in and a form of knowing of. And let's take the example of the kind of psychological or physical wounding that we experience as a child, right? There's a way in which we come to know the world through those wounds. But Laruelle's saying that there's also a kind of knowledge that is non-relational, yet maintains a relationship to it. How is the knowing in oneself ensconced within the knowing of the world for him?
Okay, so this is the given without givenness question, right? So we are given the conditions or the occasions of the world around us, rather. So like we may have philosophy given to us. We may have religion given to us. We may have theology or any sort of like traditional material given in front of us. But this is always auto-posited, always kind of like auto given to us. It's with this additive givenness that seeks to kind of like perpetuate a cycle for this sufficiency. So the idea of philosophical sufficiency is like a critique writ large in Laruelle's work with regards to how philosophical sufficiency says that everything is philosophical or everything is political, everything is religious, right? But that's just the givenness side of things. And that seeks to overdetermine the actual product of our own relationship to it. So in a way, we have this in front of us. It's provided to us, but it doesn't seek to also determine our relationship to it. So this givenness is also stripped of its sufficiency to an extent that it also becomes another given without givenness.
Actually, let me ask a clarifying question then. So we could probably say then that any event, whether it's an experiential event, a phenomenal event on planet Earth, then slots into or has a fit within frameworks of knowledge or logics, or logic with a capital L. But the kind of knowing that Laruelle is talking about is not exactly that. What I'm talking about is that what can be known can be measured, at least vis-a-vis any sort of framework that we identify as being adequate for determining what counts as knowledge. But he's talking about a different kind of knowledge, one that isn't relatable to those logics or frameworks. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And then what would be the conditions by which we come to a kind of certainty about a knowing in, a vision in God?
So this is where vision in man or vision in one kind of plays into it, right? So as a term, vision in one is the specific framework by which one is able to provide an experience of the world stripped of its worldliness, or to know the world but not be in the world, to be in the one without like having the world like to be descended into. So vision in one is for Laruelle and for non-philosophy, that which determines any theory or pragmatics of the thought world or philosophy as such in the last instance, right? This is the terminology that he uses. It is why it gives without givenness the givenness of thought, the thought world. So in other words, like it provides the material by which we can think or know the world as such, but it doesn't require this sort of like additive or supplement that is going to provide an additional kind of like benefit or surplus value upon the same thing that it's given. Hence this sort of like the dialogue that we had a couple of years ago with Acid Horizon, the capital form of thought with philosophy, right? So vision in one is defined by 5 axioms. Okay, these are open axioms, is what he argues. The one is radical immanence. It's identity without transcendence, and it is not associated with a transcendence or a division. So identity here is precisely an undivided I equals I, but not a logical identity. It's not requiring a mediation from outside of itself. It's an identity without division. Let's just say that. Because difference ends up dividing identity regardless of whether or not it distinguishes itself from it, right? The one is in one or vision in one and is not in being or indifference, right? So it's very much distinct from the difference of Deleuze or the being of Heidegger. Like it's not being in the world or in the world. The one is the real insofar as it's foreclosed to all symbolization, such as thought, knowledge, etc. The one is given without givenness and separated without separation of givenness. So it's a very interesting way of thinking about it. It's completely separated. And the one is that which determines or gives in the last instance the thought world as given or the object of a givenness. So the vision in one is this framework that has been found from the early 1990s to up until his passing last year as a kind of framework with regards to thinking about this radically unknown aspect of the one, which is not beyond us. It's not the good beyond being. It's not epikenetes ousias. It's the one of the human, the undividedness of the human. And it's not the Greek one, it's not the Judaic one, which is the other or God. It's human. It's irreducible to the Greek-Jew division that kind of is found in all of philosophy. So I don't know if that really answers your question in terms of like providing where does this come from, where does it go? But it is precisely this framework that kind of grounds the overarching, how do we get this knowledge without having to be in the world or to participate of it, right? To be a part of it. Is it possible for parts to be independent of wholes? Is one of the arguments of the earliest writings of non-philosophy. And he argues, yes, it's possible. And we have to develop a way of thinking that separates humans from the things that subjugate them.
So, yeah, the description of vision one actually, it certainly clarifies his concept, but it introduces to me another question.
Can I interject before we get
sure.
that?
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. But does that make any sense at all or no?
It does. No, it totally does. And what I'll do is I'll do my best to recast it, but I'm going to go back through the history of philosophy to do so. And I'm going to offer a thumbnail sketch, if not a complete caricature of apophatic philosophy. One of the things that understanding of God via negativa, or an understanding of the one via negativa, meaning how can we know God? Well, we can simply itemize a list of negative attributes. Well, God is not this, he's not that, he's not like this. And oddly enough, all the things that God is not are things that we either participate in or are attributed to manhood. And that's one of the ways that we get the distinction between God and man. And that was really riding roughshod over the whole tradition. But I think it's helpful here because it seems that what Laruelle is doing is he wants to avoid this tendency towards an apophatic understanding of the one. But the way that he does it is by suggesting that our relationship to the one, an understanding of the one, our being within the one, has this non-relational aspect to it. One of the trade-offs seems to be, in my opinion, is while we lose the asceticism in thought that comes with the apophatic tradition of philosophy that diminishes man in the sight of God, one of the things that, as an analytic philosopher said, the pill that we then must swallow seems like one of the risks is a kind of solipsism of our knowledge. If there was a kind of solipsism in mystical or religious or Gnostic thought, well, now it seems like that is compounded, but maybe the ascetic piece is pushed to the side. Or is it simply the case that we have now reinserted the subject back into metaphysics with the hope or the prospect of putting the obverse and the reverse of positive and negative on the same side and presupposing their continuity in some way, right? And so that's going to be solid. But what we lose in the process is a way of knowing the world with a small w. Because the kind of knowledge that we're committed to in this notion of the vision in the one is not one that necessarily pertains to phenomenality, to events within the world. Basically, what I'm asking you is, how does Laruelle get around the notion that, okay, there is no direct relationality with finite events in the world, but at the same time, there is a relation. I mean, how is it that the transcendent world intersects with what we would call the immanent finite world? And what Laruelle seems to want to do is to say that what we understand as transcendence and immanence, they are one and the same. So he's going to establish a continuity there. But in order to do that, he must say that what we know and understand as the one means that we stand outside of a break between those two things, or at least what we ordinarily understand as the break between positive and negative, or God and man, actually has this fluid continuity, but we must establish a metaphysical realm that's even like one click beyond what we ordinarily understood as dialectics in the past. And that's the move. That's the move that seems so hard for me to make. How does he ground that?
Okay, so another way of asking the question is, does non-philosophy exist on planet Earth? Right? Like, I think, does it exist in this moment, right? Like, or is it from, like, could you meet somebody down the street who's eating a Subway sandwich, and are they doing non-philosophy as such? And the answer to those questions are yes and no. And one of the reasons why I want to say yes is particularly because with regards to how it is that we are harassed by worldly factors that exist in our lives, right? We are condemned to philosophy, is what he would say. He does say. I keep on saying he would say. He does say these things. So I apologize for those listening or anything of the sort, but I don't like parroting what he would say. But he does say that we're condemned to philosophy. We're condemned to politics. We're condemned to hell, basically. And what we really are trying to think about is precisely the ways in which one's experience in the world could be impacted by it, but it's not so much to kind of allow for that to all encompass who we are or what we do. And part of what philosophy does is it separates us in a manner that reflects the Greek thought, Greek practice of philosophy, which is to know thyself in a manner that is seeking to reach and transcend, to go beyond, to reach divinity, to become what we are. And rather than like accepting that part of it, which is an active sense of reproduction, it limits the abilities of what humans can actually do, right? So philosophy is just one of many ways of how we are acting in the world. And so too with religious experience. And this is why the kind of ways in which he's trying to think about the solitude or the multitude of lone ones. These are individuals in the very literal sense, like undivided entities, who are alone, not in the sense of like, I'm separated from another person, I'm alienated from them, I'm estranged from them, but our lone essences, our lone individuality is itself separated from the things that actually tend to structure our lives. So this is to say that when we are in the world, like with a lowercase w, when we're in everyday life, this is something like where the people that are, eating their Subway sandwiches or whatever, they are more or less structured by or determined by the social structures, right? Economics, power, capitalism, etc., right? But our experiences, our intimacy of humanity is completely solitary in comparison to like how we are interacting with one another. Because let's say, for example, the situationists are right. We have to create détournement or to derive in ways that make us walk differently or challenge the environment of which we are in, right? So these are also just one way of living our lives, one way of going and losing ourselves, one way of knowing ourselves. But truly speaking, our lives are unknowable, not in the sense of like, we cannot know ourselves or we cannot know the real, or it's that it's completely closed off and barred from access or anything like that. But this is the positive side of it. It's unknowable because it is impossible to be represented, impossible to be mediated, impossible to be politicized, impossible for it to be going outside of that. Let's say, for example, in the mystical light, the sort of like solitary experience of immersion, of like experiencing ecstasy, or the experience of trying to find that light of God or anything of the sort. It's a very isolated and solitary experience that certain individuals have written on. Meister Eckhart, Teresa of Avila, Marguerite Porete, in all different ways, right? But in those experiences, they tend to also have a union with the world outside, world with a capital W. And that is where the sort of fine line is found, where that humanity is lost only to become more beyond, to become divine, to become something that we are not. And I think we can make a critique of Nietzsche here in a way that like, it's not to become what you are. You are already who you are without individuation. And I think I covered this the last time on Acid Horizon. But yeah, like I think that might suffice for an answer.
Sure.
Honestly.
And it's here. And this brings us back to our pregame chat where I brought up Blanchot and Bataille and maybe even Jean-Luc Nancy here, where Blanchot's and Nancy's concept of a community of those with nothing in common, and Blanchot's poetic reflection on Asafel and its failures, to the extent that the kind of community that Bataille and his cohort were attempting to create was one that was necessarily destined to fail because it could not forge the overlap of that uncommonality that existed between its individual members. And it's in the failure or the rupture of the notion of community that we are then returned to something like the lone that we see in Laruelle's work. What could be somewhat ironic is those movements tend to be associated with forms of anarchism. Laruelle, on the other hand, is a Maoist of sorts. And so now we have this notion of a kind of being in common that reveals its insufficiency or its inadequacy or its inability to be totalized in ways that a notion of community could be claimed, community with a capital C. It's almost as if to live means to be condemned to a form of community with a small c or a reversed c or a crumbling C, if you will. And forgive me if this fast forwards the conversation. You know, we've been talking for almost an hour now, but one of the things that I would like to touch on here is how does this notion of the vision in one, his notion of humanhood, and this understanding of the lone with a capital L, the way in which we are returned to this kind of solitary experience of ourselves, how does that then intersect with his vision of first philosophy as a democratic discipline, or a democratic activity, or non-philosophy as a democratic activity, and what does it mean for the way that he envisions the structuring of community and or the collapse of those structures that impinge upon the possibility of freedoms envisioned by communism?
Okay. So forgive me with this kind of answer, but you're not going to get a political program from me.
Okay, fair enough. But where's Laruelle at?
Okay. So, I mean, this is completely aside from, like, let's say, for example, the text that we've dealt with. I know for a fact in this book, which, again, this is kind of part of a triptych that's only a diptych. I don't know where the third book is, but the first book was Future Christ. This is the second book. The third book was supposed to be about eroticism, eros, and love, and maybe even community. I don't know. But the book on non-Marxism, okay? Non-Marxism introduces this idea of non-communism, okay? Stay with me here. It's just a lot of nons. But it's mainly because of this framing that democracy is more or less at the forefront of what Laruelle is interested in. And I'm not talking about casting your vote and going to the ballot boxes or anything like that.
And no workers co-ops or like
no, I don't know, or like I don't think he has a positive kind of vision of what this is going to look like and operatively, right? So I think the positive project of democracy into thought is, what can people do? And we don't have an idea of what people can do in their own power right now as we know it. As I mentioned before, or even my dissertation, like democracy, introducing democracy into thought is one thing. Introducing democracy in anything is another, right? So what do we mean by democracy when we talk about non-philosophy was at the forefront of my dissertation. And it's a matter of who those people are and what they do in their power or what they do in their role. Now, the positive project of this kind of democracy is an open telos, or not even an open telos. There is no telos. There's no kind of like end goal, because the thing is, the flourishing of humanity, the kingdom of humanity, the kingdom of man, if you will, is kind of opened up into this infinite set of possibilities that is indeterminate. Not in the sense of like the ways in which we can go about the world are kind of limitless, or there's no consequences to our actions or whatever. Rather, it's like, if we think about, for example, the ways in which we structure politics right now, it's not necessarily politics itself, it's onto-theopolitics, right? The idea that there is a sort of connection between politics, theology, and being it's a kind of mixture of those sorts. There's also the problem of who we are as individuals. So in the Acid Horizon podcast, I talked about anthropo-logical difference, the idea that the logos of philosophy can determine who we are, and we become mixtures of those individuals who are subjugated by the state or products of the state. And how do we like fight against that kind of way in which we're doing this? In this book in particular, he does talk about introducing democracy into Beatitudes, or in the blessings of supreme happiness. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for example, some of the sayings and the sermons on the Mount for Jesus, right? I'm a Jew, so I don't know all too much about this. This is completely outside my perspective, but he does talk about anarchy. The work of Levinas is seen in this perspective, and so maybe Rainer Sherman in a way. I don't know if Rainer Sherman is an individual that Laruelle was familiar with at all, or has kind of written on, but it is something that is of interest to me to try to think about the connection of broken hegemonies, for example, and some of the writings on the one in non-philosophy. But that's a whole other project all to its own. My whole thing right now is that when we're talking about anarchy, we're trying to think about the unsettling of the law to determine life, or to transform the law in a way that is in man's best interest, or the human's best interest. Not to say like, okay, we need to have a positive biopolitics or something like that, or any sort of ways in which our own subjugation is like our happiness or anything like that.
Well, Jeremy, I just want to say thanks again for coming on the show. And I'd like to end actually with one thing. First, thank you for translating this for us and offering me this fresh translation. I guess aside from yourself, I would have been the first Anglophone reader of Laruelle's essay on mysticism. So I think I'm honored.
Yeah. So just to interject here, there has been attempts, I guess, in several years to get this actual book translated. I know that Joshua Ramey, who is the author of the Hermetic Deleuze, wanted or has been under contract, or I don't know what the whole publishing issue is or circumstances behind it, but with Palgrave Macmillan or something along those lines. And this is something like that has been on the back burner in publication hell, if you will, for so long. And I just took it upon myself to translate this because, I mean, as I do on my blog and I have translated a couple portions from this book in general. But what I want to do is to kind of like get a better grasp of that humanity that Laruelle is interested in introducing us to through mysticism.
And with that said, I guess I will go ahead and put a link to the English translation in the show notes for this episode.
Yeah.
And I guess what I want to end with is, if somebody's not only coming to this essay as a first-time reader of Laruelle, and maybe they're not even a first-time reader of Laruelle, but if they were to get something from this essay that they thought would be an enhancement of their knowledge of mysticism, or provide a kind of tool or roadmap by which to think mysticism amidst the political. In summary, what do you think this essay and Laruelle in general offers that kind of reader?
I think it's in the passage here, and I like how he uses Teresa of Avila here in particular. I think this is of interest, I think, in general, to those of us who want to remain protected, I guess, from the world and to maintain our souls in a way. And this is the subsection called On a Fort Close Castle, but it's like foreclosure, but also like the strong castle. I tried my best to like maintain this kind of fortification, a metaphor that Teresa of Avila kind of like highlights, but also keeping in the fort closed. This idea of the soul as a black box, that in our most intimate experiences of life, our solitude, our loneliness in the world, we are impenetrable. No light can ever see this soul. It's completely dark. It's an unreflected space. What I want to leave readers with is this kind of way in which to think of our soul as protected, our way of living and loving and experiencing our lives is completely hidden, and that nothing hidden will not be disclosed. Nothing is without kind of being disclosed in the world. It's a kind of hiding place, but even God cannot pierce that veil, pierce that soul. So one of the things that I guess I want to leave with everybody in this last little bit here, while things are crashing around me, is that perhaps we are the most secret of all things in the world, and that secret is not unknowable, but lived.